Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin and I am the Director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. Today I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker, Claire Rapp with the Ohio State University. Over the next hour, Claire will be talking about her research investigating studies of homeowner risk mitigating activities in the wildland-urban interface. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Claire Rapp is a PhD student at Ohio State University studying environmental social science. She's advised by Dr. Robin Wilson. Before attending Ohio State, she graduated with a bachelor's in environmental science from UC Davis. Her work focuses on the human dimensions of wildfire, including risk perception and decision-making for residents living in the WUI and managers during fire events. So welcome, Claire. We're excited to have you with us today. Thanks everybody who's joining us online. And just one moment as we swap out presentations.
All right, thanks, David. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now.
Okay.
There we go. And let's go ahead and hop right in. So as David mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about homeowner preparedness in the wild and urban interface. This is admittedly a pretty broad topic. So in particular, I'm going to highlight the 4 goals I have for this talk. The first is to discuss the current knowledge from wildfire social science on homeowner preparedness, to give a background on what it is social scientists have found so far. Once we review that, we're going to move into examining the methods specifically of the studies that look at wildfire preparation and risk mitigation. Once we see the different methods these studies use, we're then going to move into the longest portion, or the third goal, which is to examine how these methods can affect the subsequent results of studies. And finally, after that, we're going to be talking about implications for researchers and practitioners. So let's go ahead and hop right in with our first goal, discussing the current knowledge from wildfire social science on homeowner preparedness. So residents living in the wild and urban interface can reduce their risk of property damage and home loss from wildfire. This means that wildfire inherently and wildfire preparedness is a human endeavor. So wildfire social scientists have a variety of questions that they can address: how people perceive wildfire and wildfire preparedness, what motivates action, what are barriers to action. These are all questions wildfire social scientists have examined. And in fact, there has been considerable research on wildfire preparedness. For example, in 2013, a summary of research on the social science in the WUI was published, as you can see here. The authors provided several major takeaways in this review regarding wildfire mitigation, namely that many residents in the WUI are taking action to reduce their fire risks, but awareness of risk does not automatically lead to risk reduction behavior, because decisions to mitigate the risks of fire are shaped by a variety of factors. So we're going to focus in specifically on that second and third point, that awareness of risk does not automatically lead to risk reduction behaviors, because these decisions to mitigate risk are shaped by a variety of factors. These authors in this review highlight some of these factors that influence adoption of risk mitigation activities. These include things like trade-offs with other values, preferences for your landscape around your home, for example, as well as social norms and situational factors, ecological conditions, conditions of adjacent properties. But despite all of that, perceived risk still does matter when shaping risk reduction. However, let's focus on what some studies specifically have found when they look at the role of risk perception on risk mitigation. Or to put it another way, what is the effect of feeling at risk on taking action to reduce that risk for homeowners in the wild and urban interface? Well, one study has found that risk perception had a positive effect on the number of activities completed for study sites in Colorado. Those homeowners who felt more at risk were more likely to take action to prepare their home for wildfire. Another study found, however, that risk perception had no effect on risk mitigation for residents in a study site in California. A third study found that perceived risk severity, how intense people think the magnitude of the consequences are, but not risk vulnerability, the probability of experiencing those consequences, had a positive effect on the number of activities completed for residents in Perth, Australia. Well, the final study that I want to highlight found that perceived risk severity, that severity of the consequences or the magnitude of the consequences, had a positive effect, as it did in the previous study, but only when respondents in Colorado and Oregon had more knowledge about their wildfire risk. For those who had little knowledge about wildfire risk, it did not matter how severe they thought the consequences were when trying to predict whether they mitigated their risk. And these results are not wholly incongruent with each other. They tell a story of an increasingly complex relationship between risk perception and risk mitigation. And we should expect to some extent that this would happen. Risk perception is a multidimensional construct. We should expect some variation in its importance, and how it affects risk mitigation may not be a very simple linear relationship. However, we also find similar findings for demographic variables like age. Some studies have found there's no effect of age on taking risk-reducing actions. Some have found a positive relationship between age and the number of preparedness activities completed. And one study in particular found that older respondents were more likely to make structural changes to their home, but there was no relationship between age and vegetation management. And this can ultimately be frustrating when we can't answer questions such as, if my community in particular feels at risk of wildfire, will they take action to reduce that risk? So why do we struggle to draw overarching results? Why can we not take the results of one study and necessarily apply them to another? Well, context certainly plays a role. Research on risk mitigation tends to focus on specific communities. You'll notice on that previous slide, all of those studies took place in different locations. And because of that, predictors of wildfire mitigation may vary based on the communities. For example, a homeowners association for one community may require that people establish defensible space, clearing their vegetation and reducing their vulnerability. Another community may have an HOA that has vegetation requirements that put people at greater risk. In the end, when you ask what effect do homeowner associations have on risk reduction, you can't have a simple answer. It depends on the community where the HOA is. And this should be expected because communities in the wild and urban interface are diverse, and we should expect them to behave differently to wildfire risk. These communities are unique, and just as we wouldn't expect individuals to necessarily respond exactly the same, we should expect the same of communities, that they'll respond differently. However, and I want to emphasize that context certainly plays a role, and it's very important for explaining the inability to draw overarching conclusions. However, how we measure preparedness and risk mitigation, how we construct our surveys, likely plays a role as well, because preparedness and risk mitigation research suffers from a lack of agreement on how to measure preparedness, which leads me to the second goal of this talk. Review the methods of studies that look at wildfire preparedness and risk mitigation, because there are many, many things homeowners can do to reduce the risks posed by wildfire. You can manage the vegetation around your home to reduce the probability of home ignition. You can widen your driveway to improve the likelihood that firefighters can reach your home at all. You can practice an evacuation plan so all your family members know what to do in the event of a wildfire evacuation. All of these are different forms of reducing your risk and preparing for wildfire. So perhaps it's not surprising that studies from the same year or similar research teams or the same journal will use different items. And while some studies specify how they chose their preparedness items, other studies aren't as explicit. But for those that do specify, sources include other researchers, government recommendations, and local experts. And given this variety of items that could be applicable and these different sources, It's perhaps unsurprising that we've seen a lot of different preparedness items. A team of researchers collected preparatory actions from fire agencies, disaster response organizations, and the academic literature. From the 10 sources they examined, they identified 118 unique actions homeowners could take. And I don't want to imply that this is the comprehensive list and that we should be issuing surveys that ask all about 118 items. Asking about 118 separate items in one survey is a great way to lower your response rate and have fewer people answer your survey. However, not only do we not want to ask 118 items because that's overwhelming for respondents, we also don't need to ask 118 items because which activities reduce risk depend on what actions residents intend to take during a wildfire event. Granted, some activities are important whether respondents intend to stay and defend, evacuate early, or evacuate late. Managing vegetation and installing fire-resistant features on your home can likely only help you regardless of what you intend to do. But other activities are only important if respondents intend to take a particular action when a fire happens. If respondents intend to stay and defend, it may be important to own personal protective gear or to develop a diesel-powered pump for a water vessel. But if you intend to evacuate, these items may be less important. Thus, some of the variation in preparedness and our findings trying to predict preparedness may come from people measuring different types of preparedness. Some studies focus on passive defense, just reducing the ignitability of your home. Other studies focus on active defense, and others still take a sample of items that could be applicable for multiple goals, both passive and active defense. And thus, what items people use is a source of variation between studies. But in addition to differing in what items they specifically measure, studies also vary in how they construct their measures of preparedness and risk mitigation. So for example, the most common measure is to ask about a series of items and whether or not respondents have completed them or whether they're present or not. And then you just tally them up. Preparedness is the sum of the number of activities respondents have completed. It's a relatively intuitive measure. Other studies bin respondents into categories based on their tally number. So from this list of several activities, you may then create a measure that has two levels, more prepared and less prepared. Or you may create a variable that has three levels, least prepared, less prepared, and most prepared. Other studies still use a proportion. They consider the number of activities respondents have completed divided by the number of activities applicable to them. In this way, they consider whether an activity is relevant at all before including it in their tally for homeowner preparedness. But importantly, across all of these different ways of measuring preparedness and operationalizing preparedness, it is very uncommon to weigh items based on their effectiveness or recency of completion. Most studies sum all items and treat them equally. To reduce vegetation is 1 point. To install fire-resistant siding is 1 point. To install a fire-resistant roof is 1 point. And to have a hose that reaches every point of your house is 1 point. The research that I'm going to be talking about is not going to be able to address this homogeny in how we weigh items, but I do think it's important to highlight. But given this diversity of measurements across studies, these different items that we can use and these different ways that we can generate our final preparedness variable, it's perhaps surprising that the consequences of different ways of measuring preparedness and risk mitigation are under-examined. Very little research has looked at the effect of how you measure preparedness on the final story you tell. Which leads us to our third goal. Examine how methods can affect results. We're going to do this specifically through 3 questions. We're going to ask, how do different measures of preparedness from the same sets of items compare to each other, and a holistic assessment of effort. We're going to ask how location, used as a proxy for context, and demographics affect these preparedness measures. And we're going to look at how this varies for vegetation management versus structural mitigation. And we're going to do this through a survey, particularly a mail survey, to 4 counties in 3 states: Alachua County in Florida, Ventura County in California, and Lewis and Clark and Jefferson County in Montana. These sites were selected for their diverse population, their mix of land use and ownership patterns, and their different regulatory environments. And because at the time, little wildfire survey research had been completed in that area. So this survey was issued from 2009 to 2010 with a final sample of about 1,600. Once we restrict that to homeowners, it's only 1,200. And it's at this point that I want to be very transparent. This data is old, and it's far from an objective assessment of the state of these communities today. I do not intend to tell you that this is what it is like today, February 20th, 2019, in Ventura County, California. However, the relationships between variables are still interesting to explore as a springboard for future work. The goal here is not to describe these communities as they currently are, but to do an exercise in data analysis. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at the demographics of our sample. And from here on out, for simplicity's sake, although we only sampled particular regions in each of these states, I'm going to refer to them by their state name for simplicity. So instead of Ventura, you'll hear me talking about California. But I don't mean to imply that these counties represent the states as a whole. Regardless, let's talk about our sample. So for our sample, we assessed several different demographic variables, including gender, income, age, tenure as a homeowner, and education. And what we see is pretty standard for samples of homeowners in the wild and urban interface. Our sample is older, wealthier, more educated, and more male than the population at large. But in addition to assessing demographics, we also measured preparedness. And specifically, we measured it across 2 dimensions: structural features and vegetation management. And we separated it into these 2 dimensions based on the nature of the activities. Whereas vegetation management, as you'll see in the activities that we've selected, generally require continuous upkeep. They need to be done every year or perhaps even more frequently. Structural features are a little different. Many of them need to be installed, and then they're good for many, many years. Thus, it's likely that different processes affect the likeliness of engaging in these activities. So, considering that we have 2 dimensions of preparedness, we have 2 different measures across these dimensions. The first measure was a holistic self-assessment. We asked respondents, to what extent have you done the following to prepare for a wildfire that threatens your neighborhood? Managed vegetation and made their home more fire resistant. A measure of structural features and a measure of vegetation management. Respondents could indicate from 1 to 4 whether they had done so not at all or to a great deal. This holistic question is good because it gives us insight into how much effort people feel they themselves have put in, especially for wildfires specifically. And it's informative, perhaps not by itself, but especially when comparing it to the different ways of thinking about preparedness. So our second measure across these 2 dimensions was a more traditional tally of specific items. So for vegetation management, this included the extent to which the activity had been completed. So when respondents considered item number 5, removing combustible material from around or under their decks, they could indicate that they had done no work, had done work to some degree, had done a lot of work, or that it wasn't applicable to their home. Perhaps they didn't even have a deck to begin with. For structural features, we included who installed it and why. And although we had many different levels that respondents could answer on, in the end, we binned it into 4 categories. So considering number 6, whether the underside of decks are enclosed with fire-resistant materials, ultimately, respondents could indicate that that feature was there when they purchased their home, whether they had installed that feature during their tenure, whether they hadn't installed it, or whether it was not applicable to their home. Again, you can't enclose the underside of a deck that you don't have. So with these 4 different measures across 2 dimensions, we're going to start with vegetation management. And we're going to look at how could we measure vegetation management. So we have these 7 items. And from this, we could feasibly get at least 4 different measures of preparedness from the same set of 7 items. The first measure is the most common, a simple tally. We could consider whether or not respondents had engaged in an activity at all and count up the number of vegetation management activities respondents had done even partially. We could also use a percentage of applicable activities completed. Maybe we don't want to penalize people for activities that aren't applicable to them, in which case we will restrict our measure to those that are relevant. We could also use a modified simple tally. Instead of only considering whether respondents had engaged in the activity at all, maybe we're only interested in how many activities they've put a high amount of effort towards, especially because vegetation management is not often either done or not, but has a range of completion. So given that we can have a modified simple tally of high effort, we can also have a modified percentage, and we can consider the percentage of applicable activities respondents have put high effort towards. Now, to clarify a little bit what it means to say that we calculate a percentage. In this case, for the standard percentage, we consider the number of vegetation activities respondents rated they had completed to some degree or a lot, and divided it by the number they completed to some degree, a lot, or haven't done at all. And for the modified percentage, we only consider activities rated a lot. So this measurement, instead of being measured from 0 to 7, goes from 0 to 100%. So let's look at what we learn from our different measures of preparedness. The first thing that we see could be spun as either a problem or good news. We see very high levels on these variables. Respondents tended to rate themselves 3.5 out of 4 on how much effort they put towards reducing their vegetation for wildfire. It's especially high in California, and it's lowest in Florida. Respondents in California feeling they put the most effort for wildfire, and respondents in Florida the least. We also see that respondents on average completed a majority of activities, over 5 out of the 7. And once we restrict it to activities applicable to them, and we don't penalize them for activities we can't do, the average respondent has engaged in 91% of all applicable activities. Now you could consider this excellent news. Most people have done most things at least a little bit, but it could also be interpreted differently. People may be upwardly biasing their responses. When you consider on a survey whether or not you have cleared your dead vegetation, if you haven't done it 100%, what percent have you need to have cleared before you say you've done it? Especially when you get a survey that you don't want to look bad, and so you may be prone to social desirability bias, being a little bit more optimistic in how much you have actually done, either intentionally or unintentionally. So that's where only considering the number of activities that we've put a high amount of effort comes in, and that's where we see some variation. Respondents are still doing a generally good job. Nearly half of the activities, or 60% of what's applicable to them, but it gives a very different story of the state of these communities. One is a story of a community that's effectively prepared for wildfire, but that story may not be the most accurate. The other story gives us a better picture where we can see the points of vulnerability that our communities may have. And we need to know those points of vulnerability if we are to address them. So when we go back to those 3 questions, let's revisit the first one. How do different measures of preparedness from the same sets of items compare to each other? And what we see is that we can get 2 very different pictures. We can get fundamentally different measures of preparedness from the same items. So given that, how does context and how do demographics affect these different measures? We're going to continue to look at vegetation management, and we're going to use regression. So regression, these are results of several different regression equations, each one predicting the different dependent variable, vegetation preparedness, from context and demographics. So here we can see that we used income, age, tenure, gender, education, and location to predict preparedness. In this case, California and Florida have been dummy-coded. Montana is the baseline. So when we examine those arrows, we're going to compare them to Montana specifically. So let's go ahead and look at those arrows then. Let's look at context. Here we see the effects of context. We talked about before in the literature how it's almost certainly important, and we see further evidence of that. Respondents in California tend to rate themselves the highest on their holistic assessment of vegetation management for wildfire. However, they have not done a statistically significant greater number of activities. They just feel they've put more effort towards and may attribute their actions more to wildfire. In comparison, respondents in Florida have a different story. Respondents in Florida tend to rate themselves lower on this holistic self-assessment, feeling they've put less effort specifically towards wildfire. But when we compare the total number of activities, the sum of total activities that they've completed, they don't differ statistically from Montana and California. And if we were using a simple tally, the story would end there, and we would conclude that respondents in Florida are just as prepared, but they don't ascribe their actions as much to wildfire. But it's once we move past that simple tally that we see a different story. Respondents in Florida engage in just as many activities, but they put less effort towards them, completing fewer activities to a high degree of effort, as indicated by these other 3 measures. And when we only use a simple tally, we miss this point of vulnerability, and we fail to see that respondents in Florida may still have needs that need to be addressed compared to respondents in California and Florida. Perhaps they do not need to be persuaded to be engaged in novel activities, but rather to commit to these activities more, to complete them more fully. And this is lost when using a simple tally. Now, the next thing I want to look at is age, because age has had a mixed effect in the literature. Older respondents tended to rate themselves higher on our holistic assessment. They tended to consider themselves having put more effort towards vegetation management for wildfire, but we start to see a similar but opposite story unfolding as we saw with Florida. Older respondents did not complete more activities on average than younger respondents. But the opposite of Florida, they put more effort towards the number of activities that they did do. Once you account for applicable items by using a percentage, we see a positive relationship. And this again is a hidden vulnerability. Younger people may have more points of vulnerability, so to speak. They may have more activities that are applicable to them, and they may put less effort towards addressing them. And this is missed when we don't consider the relevance of activities when calculating our measures. So when we revisit that second question, how does context and demographics affect these preparedness measures, we see that once again, context matters. It affects whether people attribute their behavior towards wildfire, and it affects how much effort they put towards each activity. although these results do not suggest that it affects the number of activities they engage in. And we also see that age matters. Older respondents have fewer activities applicable to them, and simple tallies may underestimate the vulnerability of younger respondents who may put less effort towards the activities and who have more activities they could complete. So with that in mind, what does it look like for structural preparedness? How could we measure structural preparedness? Well, again, we could use a simple tally. In this case, we could consider all features present, whether they were present when the respondent purchased their home, or whether the feature was installed by the respondent themselves. Then it's at this point that I want to clarify, when I discuss whether a feature is installed by a respondent, I don't mean to imply that the respondent had to be the one to physically install it themselves, but rather that it was installed during their tenure as the homeowner. So we could use this simple tally. We could follow up with a percentage of applicable features present, modifying the simple tally so that we don't penalize people for activities that are applicable to them, but we're still going to consider features that were present when the home was purchased. We could also pick apart what affects how many features were present at purchase. What affects this baseline vulnerability? What is related to how many features people have when they first move in? And we could also look at a modified percentage. Given that people start at a certain baseline, maybe we want to examine the percentage of applicable features that still need to be installed that respondents have addressed. Let's go into a little bit of more detail on what that means. So this modified percentage only considers missing features, features that were present when the respondent purchased their home or that were not applicable to them are not counted. We only want to consider how many features respondents have done compared to how many they have not done since purchase and do not have but are applicable. So once we have that, let's look at what we get. We see that generally people rate themselves lower on this holistic self-assessment for structural features compared to vegetation management, rating themselves still a 3 out of 4 on average. We see a similar pattern recreate itself. Respondents in California feel that they have put more effort towards installing fire-resistant features on their home for wildfire. Respondents in Florida rating themselves the lowest. We also see that people tend to have a pretty good proportion of features present. Considering both what's there at baseline and what they've installed themselves, the average person has more than half of all features present. And once we remove items that are not applicable to respondents, we see that they have roughly 70% on average. And although people tend to start with a pretty good baseline, 2.2 features on average is more than half of all features present on average, that 2.2 compared to the 3.6. People are indeed still installing features. It's not just that they are lucky enough to move into a home with these features present and are profiting off of that luck. People are indeed addressing on average about half of the remaining gaps in their vulnerability. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and examine, since these are clearly different measures of preparedness, they were designed specifically to measure different things. Let's go ahead and once again look at the role of context and demographics for structural mitigation. And we're going to once again use our good old friend regression. Once again, predicting the different structural preparedness variables from our dummy-coded location variables, Montana again being our baseline, and our demographic variables. And what we see, again, is the effect of context. Californians tend to have more features present than respondents in Montana, and they have filled more gaps compared to respondents in Montana. even though they don't tend to rate themselves any differently on this holistic self-assessment. This is curiously a mirror of what we saw with vegetation management, where they tended to feel they had done more, but had not necessarily done more. Here we see they don't feel any different, but not only do they tend to have more features present at baseline, they move into homes with more features present. They then subsequently fill more gaps in their vulnerability than respondents in Montana. In comparison, respondents in Florida again don't tend to ascribe their actions to wildfire, and they don't seem to have more features present overall as a tally. But they do tend to fill more gaps because more items are not applicable to them, or to put more simply, fewer items are applicable to them. This is again further evidence that not considering applicability adds noise and reduces power to preparedness measures. And the next thing that I want to examine is the relationship between age, tenure, and structural features. Because tenure and age are clearly related. Older respondents tend to be longer tenants. Generally speaking, if you spend a year at your home, you tend to also age a year. What we see here are two ways what a broader variable, time, could affect preparedness and vulnerability. One of the stories that we see unfolding here is the effect of age. Older respondents tend to feel that they've done more to structurally prepare their home for wildfire, and they have indeed installed more features. They have more features present, even though they don't tend to have more features present at baseline. They have perhaps installed more. But we also see a reverse effect happening, that respondents who have been there longer tend to have fewer features present, and fewer features present specifically at baseline. So we're getting opposite results from two very similar variables. And what may be happening here is that these two variables do indeed work in different ways. That the longer a respondent has lived in their home, perhaps the older their home is, and the fewer features that were present at baseline. However, as they get older, they may be more inclined to install features, which suggests that younger respondents may have newer homes with more features built initially, or they move into homes that have been upgraded, perhaps by previous respondents, or previous tenants rather. I don't want to suggest that this data is sufficient to unpack this story and provide an explanation. However, what it does highlight is that there's something going on with age and tenure that can't be captured with a very simple, as respondents get older, this tends to happen. So given all of these different results, these different ways of measuring preparedness across dimensions and across metrics, what does it all mean? Which means for goal 4, it's time to discuss the implications for researchers and practitioners. And in particular, I want to highlight a couple takeaways. When preparedness is the sum of activities completed by the respondent, people may appear more vulnerable or less prepared if activities are not applicable to their home or if the features were installed before they moved there. There seems to be some baseline in the WUI, particularly for structural features. We also see that assessments of personal effort, this holistic variable, are similar to, but separate from, counts of mitigation activities. Further research is needed to understand the management implications of these differences though. For example, it's yet unknown how perceived effort, how much you feel you've done to manage your vegetation for wildfire, affects willingness to take novel actions, to engage in a totally new activity being suggested for you. It's also unclear under what circumstances this perceived effort and this actual preparedness are more or less decoupled, but these are likely important questions to answer. We also see that some areas may be less likely to prepare because of wildfire risk, but are not necessarily more vulnerable or less prepared. Consider the case of Florida and their structural mitigation. Respondents in Florida had the lowest on the holistic assessment of structural features for wildfire, even though they tended to be just as structurally prepared. They may simply have done so for non-wildfire reasons, because people mitigate risk for a variety of reasons, sometimes unintentionally, and constraining measures to things done because of wildfire may underestimate preparedness if there are competing motivations. We also see that demographics may play an important role in preparedness that is lost when using a simple tally. As we saw, older respondents put more effort towards vegetation management, but didn't engage in more activities overall. But we also saw that they made more structural changes to their home, but tended to have fewer structural features present at purchase. Demographics likely don't impact risk mitigation directly, but are rather associated with processes that lead to mitigation. Thus, demographic characteristics may be associated with two processes that lead to different outcomes. The final result when trying to examine simple relationships between a demographic variable and preparedness is noise. So you may be wondering, ultimately, so we have all of these measures, we have all this data, we have learned all these lessons. Okay, how should we measure preparedness? And the answer is, it depends. If the goal of research is to understand reactions to the threat of wildfire, that should probably be specified in the question. Framing questions in terms of responses to wildfire may affect how respondents approach these questions. But regardless of intention, tallies are problematic when items vary in importance and applicability to respondents. This is easily resolved by using a percentage-based approach, and I recommend this. Finally, we see that assessing comprehensiveness may provide valuable information for activities that can have a range of completion and can reduce ceiling effects. For something like vegetation management, it may be more informative not just to ask whether or not respondents have done it, but to what extent. Because these surveys are likely prone to social desirability bias and people being generally optimistic. Giving them options gives better detail. Which leads me to some final concluding thoughts and some questions unanswered. We still have questions unanswered about baseline structural preparedness. How has housing stock changed over time? And do people consider fire-resistant features when purchasing their home? And does this differ for people moving into the wild and urban interface from elsewhere versus people moving from one part of the WUI to another? This is perhaps an important question to examine, especially as housing stock changes over time, as growth in the WUI increases, and as the nature of homes perhaps changes. We also still have questions about vegetation management. Given that respondents don't think of vegetation management as a binary, and they vary in how much effort they put towards each activity, where do they tend to put the most effort? When do they think an activity is sufficiently completed to check it on a survey? And finally, I want to close with a discussion of trade-offs. Particularly, earlier I mentioned that preparedness literature suffers from a lack of agreement on how to measure preparedness. But to a point, this is inevitable. Different communities have different sources of vulnerability that need to be addressed. But this comes with the trade-off of generalizability. And this research can't solve this trade-off. I can't tell you how much a survey should be narrowed in scope to the community versus broadened to generalizability across WUI communities. But rather, this research just seeks to call for further examination and awareness that this trade-off is being made. Because ultimately, how prepared a community looks depends on what you look at. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Claire. Once again, if you joined us during the presentation, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program. We just had a presentation by Claire Rapp from Ohio State University talking about her recent research looking into studies within the wildland-urban interface. At this point, we have some time remaining in our hour today for question and answer from the audience. So if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A box, and we will get through them as best we can and allow Claire to address them. And if for some reason, if you have any difficulty getting a question into the Q&A box, you're welcome to go ahead and type them right into the chat window. Here's one that already came in from Megan, and maybe this here is more of a comment. She says, "We think your unanswered questions are spot on based on our experience with a number of resident groups who participate in the FireWise USA recognition program."
Thanks. I think these questions are super interesting. I think they're very important to address, both from an academic standpoint and a practitioner standpoint. I think it's academics have a desire to sort of explain things from a psychological perspective. But in order to really get at the role of psychological factors in human behavior, the first thing you really need to do is understand the context that you're applying these factors towards. When you're not working in a lab, things are messy and things are noisy. And I think we're only doing ourselves a disservice by lacking what I think is crucial information about these communities.
I think your overall sum of how you measure preparedness impacts how you perceive preparedness is certainly an interesting thing to think about, and it's not something I've really seen elsewhere. We're getting a few more questions coming in on the Q&A pod here. One question is if you'd be willing to share a PDF copy of your presentation in the future to go along with the recording.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'd be more than happy to. And I can include it with my speaker notes or without it, whatever's easier.
Okay, great. Well, we appreciate that, and we will get that posted, a link to that when we get the recording up on our YouTube channel. Here's a question that came in from Daniel back towards the beginning. He was asking about the sample size from the survey that you worked with, and he's indicated that there were roughly 300 or so samples that were excluded from the analysis. Do you know what was going on there?
Oh yeah, those were people who were not homeowners. So they were renters. I think they were primarily renters. So we had questions that assessed, whether you rented a home, lived in a home, rented a condo. And so that 300 or so, 400 or so drop were people who didn't own their home.
Okay, all right, well, thank you. Here's one that came from Laurel, and she says, there's been quite a bit of research on the fact that wildfires impact already disadvantaged groups disproportionately. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you've looked at in this data set?
Yeah, this data set, so there's really interesting research. I'm going to focus specifically on socioeconomic status, even though there are many other forms of vulnerability. This data set is not equipped to really dig into socioeconomic status because our only measure is this really simple income. And what you can see is that income itself it's not even informative by itself, because income is only relevant once you contextualize it to the cost of living and the sort of real income of a place. As far as the interaction between vulnerability and ability to prepare for wildfire, as far as socioeconomic status goes, there are really interesting questions about sort of dual mechanisms for vulnerability that may happen for low-income people. when we look at structural features, for example, what kind of homes do low-income people purchase if they can even purchase a home? Let's assume they can for the sake of this example. When we saw that people had a certain baseline of structural features, how does that differ for low-income people? And what features do they tend to have or not have? Do they start with more vulnerable homes, and then on top of it, they don't have the income or the time or the expertise to then address those gaps? I can't necessarily speak to whether that is happening, and this data is not equipped to look at that, but those are certainly interesting questions that I think need to be examined.
So we had a couple other questions that have come in, and they mirrored a question I had that came up as you were giving your presentation. And it gets to the idea that these are self-assessment responses, and how those self-assessments were analyzed, they influenced the results or the interpretations of those data.
Yeah.
And two of the questions that came in said, all right, well, how do you have a sense of, or is there any possibility of getting an idea as to how a professional, if they actually did a risk assessment on the ground, might come up with a results or come up with their own risk assessment? How does that compare to the self-assessment that the homeowners provided?
Yeah, so there was a study that I read that I don't think I have in my citations, but there was I can speak to this from my particular knowledge of one study. So take that as you will. But there was a study that examined. They did an expert assessment of property conditions of people's vulnerability and their preparedness, and then they also surveyed homeowners and asked them, what activities have you done, to what extent, and how important are these activities? And I found it a little entertaining. Homeowners tended to display a sort of, I guess you call it like a multi-level wrongness. They tended to overestimate how much they had completed activities, and they tended to misattribute how important activities were. Sort of those things that are very visible, that you can very clearly say, I did this thing, it has this visible outcome, people tend to think is the most important. Whereas some of the less visible things, particularly major expensive changes to the home, like the roof and the siding of your home, they may not necessarily think is as important. So we definitely know that homeowners are going to have a different assessment of their preparedness and their vulnerability from experts. As far as addressing the fact that they will upwardly bias their responses, this is something, and this is not unique to homeowners in wildfire and the wild and urban interface. Like this is a phenomenon of human psychology. When we answer surveys, we are optimistic in how much we've done, and we're prone to social desirability bias even when we have the best intentions. So adding more range in your variables, instead of just measuring, did you or did you not remove your ladder fuels, giving them a spectrum to compare, you may not be able to objectively say they are at this level of preparedness, but you need variance in your variables. You need a degree and difference between respondents if you then want to do statistical analyses to predict preparedness. And in that case, you can't necessarily predict an objective assessment, but you can predict relative differences in perception, which is something, but not everything.
So if we were to sum up your suggestions, if we have some wildland urban interface mitigation specialists on the line today, some WUI specialists, and they were looking for a take-home message in terms of a particular, based on your study so far and your experience, is there a particular analysis method that you would suggest they work with in their studies?
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, just in their studies in general, just sort of a take-home method that they would you suggest a tally method or the percent method or something else that just as
Yeah,
a
yeah.
generalization?
Mhm. So if you're a practitioner, and let's say the goal is to understand the state of your communities as they currently are, you simply want to know how many features are present or not. You don't care whether they've done them specifically for wildfire. I would generally recommend we can't, when creating the list of items, try to make them relatively co-equal in their importance. So, for example, if you're going to ask about structural features and you're going to ask, have you installed siding? Have you installed a roof? Have you installed windows? Have you covered your vents? And you have that level of detail. For vegetation management, you should use a similar level of detail. So don't ask, have you established defensible space? Ask, have you cleared vegetation near the windows? Have you cleared shrubs near trees? Have you planted trees far apart? To sort of get at this fact that all of our measures of preparedness so far don't account for the relative importance of activities. But if you use that sort of separation by degree, you can make them more equal. And I would recommend that. I would recommend for vegetation management, including a range of completion for any activity. You likely don't want to include just simply, is it there, is it not there? Which this comes with a trade-off that the more detail you have, the longer your surveys are. And that is a legitimate trade-off. But for vegetation management, it's likely important to include a range of completion, not just have you done it or have you not, but to what extent. And for structural features, if it is important, assess the difference between what homeowners themselves have put in and what was there at purchase. I think it is very, very important to include whether an activity is applicable to respondents at all. And I think the tally is a problematic measure. I think the percentage-based approach is an easy way to solve that problem, and I would recommend it over the tally.
Excellent. And that puts us right at the top of the hour. And I think that you summarized and gave a great take-home message there. So thank you very much, Claire, for joining us today and for your presentation. One moment, and I'll pull up our final slide here.
Oh, let me go ahead.
Okay.
Got you.
And this will have, there you go. That has Claire's email address on there. So if you have remaining questions and would like to reach out to her, you have her contact information. If you would like to apply for SAF CFE credit for participating today, you can follow the link on the screen there, or I also pasted the links into the chat box. And if you have any trouble accessing that survey, it's just a short bit of information that we ask you to provide that we then share that with SAF. You can send me an email at d.godwin@southernfireexchange.org. And finally, as we close out the webinar today, we do ask that you please take just a couple of minutes to fill out a 5-question survey, ironically, and let us know your thought on the webinar today and how we might improve our future webinars to meet your fire science needs. Today's webinar was recorded, and we will have it archived for later viewing on our Southern Fire Exchange YouTube channel, along with a link to a PDF of the slides. Thanks, Claire. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope this webinar will be useful in your fire management programs. And thanks once again, Claire, for giving a great presentation. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, David. I was happy to have the opportunity.